consumers stare in wonder at the latest facet of life overtaken by the computer age, the department store. But while the Cebu store is proud of its technology, it is worried that customers will feel it has lost the human touch.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we...
Right now, Ray Pete, Georgi Dinkov. Georgi, sorry, interrupted you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, my question was related to the discussion we just had is basically if in past periods of Earth's history there were such massive animals and also massive vegetation, I mean, really dwarfing in terms of size the trees that we have nowadays, and not only the height, but also like the thickness, and it was everywhere. There weren't really, I don't think there were any areas of deserts back in dinosaur time. So do you think like the Earth was more geologically active at that time, basically that was able to support all of these organisms?
Yeah, I think the Earth was outgassing lots of carbon dioxide and oxygen, and internal heat was probably adding to the climate warmth.
And speaking related again to, I guess, the Earth supporting all of this, are you familiar with the abiogenic theory of oil creation?
Oh, yeah. I had many years ago read the what's the periodic table?
Mendeleev.
Yeah. He was interested in oil chemistry, and he dissolved iron in acid, and floating on the liquid when it was dissolved was an oily material, and he took samples of it to various petroleum chemists and asked them to identify it, and they all recognized it as petroleum and could even give the region that it smelled like. And that was, I guess, 1859 or something.
So he dissolved iron into what?
Hydrochloric acid, I think it was.
Okay. So dissolving metal into hydrochloric acid basically made it look like oil.
Iron is a high carbon content metal. And so it was the catalytic effect of the iron on the intrinsic carbon that produced the oil. And so that interested me in the Russian understanding of petroleum, and that had been they were publishing various theories of that in the early 60s, 1960s is when I started reading it, and there was an article about something to do with the renewability of oil wells published in Science News, and I wrote them a letter about the Russian studies on the theory that it's being generated deep in the earth, and so you can pump out an oil well and have it come back after several years. And when that letter was published, this guy, Tom, what's his last name? He's one that is considered to have invented the abiotic oil theory, at least for Western chemistry. He about a year after that, published his first article on abiotic oil, but leaving out all of the interesting Russian history.
Did you know in 2011 they found oceans of liquid methane and oil on one of Saturn's moon, Enceladus? And it created a little bit of controversy, but mainstream media quickly shut it down. There were some people saying like, well, so how is this possible? Either there were dinosaurs or some kind of a life on that moon of Saturn, or the creation of oil or all fossil fuels, quote unquote, doesn't require life.
And the intrinsic heat of the giant planets, that is still being confirmed. The giant gas planets are emitting heat in proportion to their mass, and that's consistent with the whole planetary creation of everything that happens on the planet. Not just driven by solar energy, but the internal chemistry of the planet.
So do you think in that case, things like peak oil are just another political psyop that's basically created to feed the narrative of climate change and, the Great Reset and so on?
The deep ocean vents that are emitting organisms, basically, a whole ecology of up to worms, but in the super hot ocean water, the high pressure lets them tolerate the heat, and the emissions, volcanic emissions into the ocean water are providing the life-supporting system. I think that's a model of how life originated. Hot rocks and gas interacting with water, producing very quick, highly developed ecologies, and the whole story of gradual evolution, I think, is really just looking at how the phases of the Earth's development turn out rather than random gene accumulation.
So basically, if I can make a jump here, a thought jump, evolution is a energetically driven process. It doesn't necessarily proceed in a straight line or even progress all the time. It really depends on the energetic supplies from the environment.
But the novel thing is to see it driven from the inside of the planet rather than just from the sun.
Okay. Do you think there were times during Earth's history when there were organisms, or maybe even if you read mythology and believe the mythology, there were human races or humanoid-like beings that were more advanced than us? Do you think that makes sense based on,
there have been fossil observations of what seem to be petrified human-like things in rock that was believed to be millions of years old. And all of those extreme anomalies get people include them in literature and such, but they don't make it into the science journals.
Are you familiar with the Hinduist mythology? They have these periods of development in the universe, and apparently right now we're living in the period that's like the least beneficial for organisms. They call it, I think, Kali Yuga, under the goddess of the evil. And their mythology says that in the past there were periods when the environment was much more. I mean, they speak about gods, but really it's all allegory. And in the past there were periods when the environment was much more conducive for civilization and consciousness, and the human beings of these past eras were 10 feet tall. They were living 900 years, which immediately led me thinking of the Boskop skull and the stories of the Bible of Methuselah living 900 years and whatnot. Do you think all of these things could be talking about the same phenomena, like civilizations being better in the past at some point?
Yeah, and even in the last 100 years or so, we see extreme differences in lifespans that the official biology industry just says that it's all lies. But the churches have been keeping birth records on people for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the records are there showing people, quite a few, well over 150 years old.
In terms of civilizational development, what do you think is I don't know if there's an optimal energy source, but is there, or do you think there's an optimal energy source? I mean, I would think you would be heavily against nuclear power, right?
Sure. Volcanic power is the obvious thing.
Basically converting that to, like geothermal energy? Is that what you have in mind?
Okay. Yeah. It's generously available and easy to get.
The life arising from the ocean, that was in the living state, St. Georgi, that was also his thesis, that we couldn't leave the ocean until we figured out how to bring it with us, like the water in our bodies. Is that on the right track?
No, I don't think that's the membrane people talking.
Okay.
They had to invent genes that could make a seal membrane that would let the cell hold water, but the primitive proteins spontaneously generated in a few minutes in the lab by Sidney Fox. Those proteins are water regulatory, create their own appearance of a membrane. They have a very standard, regular size, and they can assimilate new proteins, and when they do, they bud off just like a yeast, forming a little sphere that then assimilates more protein and grows up to the standard size, at which point it buds. So all of this is something that happens in a matter of hours in the experimental laboratory, and the evolutionists are just trying to hang on to their picture of history and how a cell requires a membrane.
Okay, well, you mentioned how life can be the volcanoes and the creation of life in the water. How does that translate to like eventually forming us? Like, what's the
when a volcano happens to be near the edge of the ocean, or just in a place that gets rained on, then you get the same thing happening. Just with the drier surroundings. But the proteins regulate the ocean to keep out excess water, and they regulate the air environment to keep in the right amount of water. It's hygrophilic enough that it's self-regulating for the water and mineral content.
So the ocean plays the role of what was that experiment that recently was done? Somebody threw like water on like really hot rock, and then amino acids started spontaneously emerging.
Yeah, that's Sidney Fox that
Okay.
created the spontaneous cell-like spheres.
Did you ever have any
So,
communication with him, right?
nope.
What? So I have the Biosphere by Vladimir Vernadsky. A few quotes up, and he says creatures on Earth are the fruit of extended, complex processes and are an essential part of the harmonious cosmic mechanism. And so, when was he writing that? Was that in the 18? The how old is this?
19,
Ah.
20, 30 period, I think.
And then you have a quote about like an old interview where you say talking about purpose, you speak more like a religious person, but but this whole idea of energy being thrown into a system and complexifying, that's kind of what Vernadsky was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
That things spontaneously organize and create higher and higher organized structures.
in terms of driving the course of evolution, would you think it's the Earth's internal activity and energetic balance that's a bigger factor, or solar activity and other planets, or is it all like together, the totality of it?
The present condition on Earth is being slightly modified and directed by changes that interact between planets and the sun. But the same basic tendency to basically create hotter, faster, bigger brains that organize bigger, longer-lived organisms. That's the general drift that Vernadsky talked about.
Are you familiar with the work of this young professor at MIT, who's basically verbatim said what you just did? And his theory now, and he's presenting his own, is that basically life is simply an energy dissipating mechanism, and you can measure the complexity of life by measuring the intensity of the energy dissipation process, which is just another word for metabolism. I think he's like 32 years old or something. Are you familiar with his work?
Yeah, and there's a Russian that I think he died about 20 or 30 years ago that had carried on the idea to study the energy dissipation in an egg. He described the process as an egg unscrambling itself by the intensity of the energy that it produces.
So, in other words, it's the energy dissipation that keeps the egg from randomizing itself, and the same thing for all life.
It's a generator of higher and higher order. So the egg is apparently mostly random stuff when you compare it to the organism that comes from it. But it's the ability to produce energy with just enough of the residual information put into it by the mother system that will shape how that energy develops. But the whole process is really the ability to produce energy very fast, starting with the egg and the early embryo, and then that's modified by the conditions it runs into.
What was the name of the guy who challenged Hayflick, and he had the opposite idea of him, that basically he said that cells are immortal, and he did his experiments with chicken embryos? Alexis
Carrel.
Carrel, yeah.
Yeah. So do you think because if you read the official story, they said, oh, he was a fraud, like he was basically towards the end of his life. Yeah.
It always has to be a fraud. Anything that is very clear and obvious, it had to be that these technicians over a period of 20 years were all participating in a fraud to introduce new chickens.
So when do you think that drive started happening to prove that that life on its own decays, and basically, that's our destiny. There's nothing that can be done about it. Because it seems like the early 20th century, most of the scientific consensus, which is a bad thing, but at the time everybody believed, based on the available evidence, that cells were immortal unless harassed externally by a bad environment.
Mendel really started it as his attempt to disprove all of Charles Darwin's unorthodox Lamarckism. Mendel was going to prove that genes are immortal and that it's only the soma or body that's mortal. And that was taken up by August Weismann in the 90s. He was the guy that amputated the tails of 1,200 mice and said their offspring still had tails, so Lamarck and Darwin were wrong. And he advocated the wear and tear cause of aging because the genes are immortal and they spin off the dregs that don't. He said they don't even have the genetic ability to make any more. The process of differentiating, according to Weismann, was a progressive loss of potential as it thins out the inheritance genes. And so this somatic dregs is just constantly wearing out the way a machine wears out because there's no mechanism for renewal. And so that set the tone for the 1900 rediscovery of Mendel and the creation of the so-called neo-Darwinian view in which Darwin is censored. The genetics industry was committed to this idea of the mortal body being a machine, and the mechanistic reductionist approach to biology is strongly based on those religious. Mendel did it for religious glory, and Weismann did it for who knows what.
So speaking of genes and evolution, I guess at this point it's probably clear that genes are not the drivers of evolution. They're just simply the result of it, right? So these attempts to drive evolution by the modern genetics establishment by messing with the genes, they're not really affecting evolution at all. If you want to affect evolution, you should be modulating the energetic supply, which is exactly what they're not doing. Am I reading this right?
Yes, Sidney Fox, in demonstrating that his artificial cells could not only assimilate nutrients and increase their size and numbers, but he added the makings of nucleic acids, just the free bases that are DNA synthase system turns into genes. He fed these nucleic acid precursors to his protocells, and they, with only the spontaneously formed proteins, they polymerized the precursors into DNA-like substances.
In terms of, do you think there are missing pieces in the theory, in the current theory of evolution? The one that's being taught in schools right now. I mean, for example, they're saying the humans and chimpanzees are very close relatives, and they descend from a common ancestor. But there's no archaeological evidence at least that's what they claim, that has ever been found of a common ancestor of these two species. What do you make out of that?
All kinds of alternatives are possible. For example, one that a vegan tribe decided to restrict their diet to leaves and an occasional bug, and that caused them to expand their digestive system, get big bellies, and to not be able to support such big brains, and they turned out looking like chimpanzees.
Okay.
And if you look at the implications of what Sidney Fox did, that amino acids spontaneously make proteins, which spontaneously are able to make analogs of DNA, then you've got the central dogma of the Watson-Crick approach to genetics. They said that information flows only from DNA to RNA to protein, never the other way. But Sidney Fox showed that information is generated spontaneously in proteins, and that they can then insert order in the precursors and actually make DNA from protein. So it completely it shows the experimental basis, energy basis for reversing the Watson-Crick approach.
I posted a clip on, of us talking about evolution, and one of the comments was, how could have what Ray was talking about be possible? Because everybody knows we evolved under very harsh circumstances, and so in your point of view, is that possible? Like we evolved during an ice age or some really unfavorable scenario?
I think the real evolution was happening in the tropics with good diet and happiness, and that when people drifted off trying wheat-based industry and agriculture, that some of them created a dairy industry and turned out to continue evolving. Others didn't do so well and degenerated into war-loving tribes and countries.
But like a level deeper of that, like the achievement of the human organism that would had to have been maintained in an oxidized redox balance, and you couldn't have, that would be impossible under extremely harsh conditions. Is that right?
Yeah. Just the whole idea that the brain requires an abundance of energy flowing through the organism to develop, and the whole fantasy that magic, like cosmic rays, for example, breaking genes. People have been looking at the effect of mutations on proteins now for 100 years, and they've never created a better gene.
Yeah, speaking of which, yeah.
By random mutation.
I have friends who work in genetics, and we've had these exact same arguments. They said, look, we've been trying, I mean, our field has been trying for over 100 years to create new species in the lab, and we've been unsuccessful. And I said, well, what have you been doing? Well, we've been blasting them with ionizing radiation. We've been exposing them to mutagens. We've been stressing the cells in all kind of different ways. And yes, they do mutate, but they don't appear to be creating new types of organisms. And
those people are walking around free in society.
That's true. They're actually pretty high placed too. They're not peons either.
Yeah, you would think some kind of a gross mental defect was involved. and such silly ideas.
So speaking of growth mental defect, do you think the redox balance and the way basically the way a well differentiated organism depends on the intensity of the metabolism and the redox balance being heavily in favor of oxidation, do you think the same thing happens at the mental level? The ability to hold a diversity of ideas and to see each new piece of information as expanding your horizon rather than limiting it, would that also be kind of like the analogy of a well differentiated mind, which requires an oxidative metabolism?
Yeah, and it also requires a surrounding world that responds in some sense, that gives it scope for development, rather than the idea that competition between individuals drives improvement. There's no more evidence for that than for X-rays causing evolution.
That's right. There was an article that came out maybe about 5 years ago, which said that, anyway, of course, it was immediately vilified, and it was in the Nature journal. It said that all the evidence that we have so far indicates that when organisms strive, they regress. And I thought, then how is it possible that this is the driving force of evolution? Then we should be seeing like more and more primitive life forms. It would be evolution in reverse.
Yeah. That's really a socio-political argument, that for your own good, we're starving you.
Exactly. you should tighten up your belt because it's better for you, right? You've been losing weight.
Yeah.
Semi-related, but Ray, you had quoted David Bohm in one of your articles, and you said the being of matter, or he said the being of matter is its meaning. The being of ourselves is meaning. The being of society is meaning. The mechanistic view has created a rather crude and gross meaning, which has created a crude and gross and confused society. So that ties into.
That's an example of something that is so true that it's very funny.
Do you think this whole idea that I think Western civilization is kind of driving towards in the last 100 years, that they've managed to convince people that simply being is not enough, and that basically people are now like restless. They can't sit still and they can't enjoy themselves simply living their lives because they're constantly being told you just have to do something meaningful with your life. Do you think there's a more nefarious purpose behind these political messages?
Especially when they're combined with the impossibility of doing something meaningful to yourself.
That creates a rather confused and almost suicidal human being, right? Because you're always failing.
You must do this, but you're only permitted to do what we say is meaningful.
We talked about a quote from Maslow the last live stream, and he said something like, "The only happy people I know are the ones doing work that they feel is meaningful." And how many people can say that they do that?
Occasionally a person gets in a position where it's possible, but usually the ones who do that quickly get fired. But occasionally that can work within the system, but it's the great exception.
Are you familiar with those studies from the 1960s that showed that doing altruistic work for others activates the neocortex and actually makes it grow, and doing stuff entirely for yourself only activates the lizard brain and actually shrinks the total brain volume?
I don't remember seeing those, but it sounds logical.
Okay. Do you think it's possible that somebody would have a meaningful life doing nothing except satisfying their own needs, often at the detriment of others?
No. That experiment you mentioned shows exactly that you need meaning to include everyone, and ideally the whole ecosystem benefiting from your project.
So in order for meaningfulness to increase, other people need to be involved. So you should be investing in the environment instead of investing in yourself, as the current mantra goes.
Yeah.
So the elite are motivated by some type of self-loathing type of situation. They're not satisfied in any way, shape, or form.
I think at an early stage in life, they swallowed and believed an image of themselves that someone told them what they were, and they're stuck in that mistaken image of what any organism is. But all of our societies tend to do that, to tell little kids who they are and what they are and what the rules are. And unless you see yourself as deeply involved in your project, that you're defining and discovering yourself in the process of what you're doing. That's part of what altruism does to the brain, that your sense of self is based on this defining yourself constantly through experience and assimilating the viewpoints of others to expand your experience, and then ideally working for the expansion of everyone's experience. But if you're stuck on a model of what you are, you're this particular historical entity, usually with religious imagery. This imposed idea of what you are is going to say that your destiny is to serve that image and look for power, for example, power and wealth, so that early implanted image of you survives and thrives, rather than constantly looking at the world as part of your own definition to complete understanding of yourself. You have to keep going into the world.
Have you noticed that some of the most pathological people, some of the most evil ones, tend to come from either religions or social practices that seem to involve self-mutilation or mutilation of very young people? Circumcision is probably the one that's the most commonly practiced. Do you think that plays a role into traumatizing these young minds very early on, and they basically grow up to hate the world and try to revenge, I guess, for the rest of their lives?
Yeah. I don't know if we talked about this before, but a guy at Oxford, J.D. Unwin, argued that civilization comes from repression, and sexual unhappiness drives the high creative societies. But what a creative society is one that makes war and conquers everyone around it. And he looked at the records of advanced and simple civilizations and drew that generalization that repression and body negating processes lead to essentially the war-making high civilizations. A guy working at the National Institute of Mental Health in the 1960s published an article in Journal of the Atomic Scientists on body pleasure, and I forget the rest of the title, but looking at these same 80 or 81 or two very detailed records of societies at all levels, and found that all kinds of body mutilation, circumcision, lip expanding, earrings, tattoos, the whole range of body mutilation goes with hierarchy in the society. Women and children are under control and inferior in status. Enemies are basically to be killed or subordinated. And basically the outlook of high civilizations, even if they're just a very nasty tribe somewhere, but the rule from these 80 societies showed that the egalitarian societies that didn't mutilate the children and didn't suppress women and repress sexuality, these were peaceful with their neighbors.
So do you think in regards to pleasure and and freedom and being able to participate in activities that sort of enhance your well-being, do you think that may have something to that may partially explain the fact that almost every culture around the world was found to dabble into either alcohol or psychedelics or other things, mind-enhancing substances, and those that most often did that seem to achieve, at least in the past, pretty high levels of civilization.
Yeah, and they were not warlike. In Central America, the drug-using cultures were generally civilized by ordinary ideas of culture and civilization, but they had highly developed arts and weren't interested in conquering people.
Yeah, and medicine too. I think the Incas were able to perform brain surgeries 1,000 years before medicine even knew what a scalpel was.
Yeah, the Northern Europeans were still very barbaric when the Incas and other Central and South American cultures, Abyssinia, cultures all around the world were highly civilized when Northern Europeans were still slaughtering each other. Very, very crude societies.
Speaking of early childhood traumatizing experiences, do you think the current environment of encouraging women, quote unquote, encouraging, they're really being forced for a variety of economic reasons to sort of dump their children into these, mass scale childcare facilities at the age of 4 to 8 weeks and then go back to work? Do you think that has a similar effect of, well, not maybe the same as circumcision, but, parental neglect? It's surely stressful for a baby, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, and that version of feminism was strongly promoted by the CIA through people like what's her name?
Gloria Steinem.
Gloria Steinem, yeah. The turning women into aggressive, competitive competition for men.
There was that Jaffe Barrelson memo between Planned Parenthood and I think, the people that wrote it worked for the Rockefeller Foundation later, where they were trying to get women into the workplace, and they were saying restraining child care and promoting different aspects of culture to do that. So, yeah. Did you have any more questions about cultural things, George?
Yeah, I just had one, but it just flew out of my mind. I guess I have to remember it. Oh, yes, the different versions of feminism. I first 12 to, I guess, maybe even almost 15 years of my life, because communism officially ended in Bulgaria in 1989, but sort of continued to sort of partially survive until maybe 3 or 4 years later. But the version of feminism promoted in socialist societies, at least part of the Soviet bloc, was very different than the feminism that I see being promoted here. Is there a reason for that, do you think? Because the way the socialism, at least the idea was that women are allowed to do what they want with their lives, and the state is supposed to help them out, not force them into specific careers or sort of like force them to abandon their children. I mean, to this day, if you go to like certain European countries, there are 2 to 3 years of paid maternity leave, and they get their full salary.
Yeah, the CIA's feminist program was exactly an anti-socialist feminism program, because what you just described is absolutely destructive to the capitalist ethic.
So they basically said, "Oh, this is what the communists are doing, and if you're a good capitalist woman, you'll embrace our version of feminism and not what the Reds are trying to sell you on."
Right. Become an aggressive, money-seeking male equivalent.
Do you think that the term toxic masculinity also has its roots in the CIA-driven culture?
Yeah, machismo is one of these implanted ideas. It defines you, what you can become and how you should behave early as a child. 4 or 5 years old, it's already embedded. And that machismo implant is just one side of the CIA feminist implant.
Was there at any point in, I guess, the 20th century, did you notice the CIA or the powers that be kind of getting concerned that socialist ideas are spreading to America, especially like the socialist version of feminism? Was there kind of like a counter movement here saying like, oh, don't listen to the propaganda, the Reds are trying to brainwash you? Was there ever a concern that basically the Soviets may be winning the war of the minds?
Oh yeah, that was the motive for the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Very, very conscious. People like John Dewey was already working on it, as far as anyone knows, free of the secret police, but definitely in harmony with them. And these pre-existing pro-capitalist ideas were scooped up by the CIA, and when they saw the real danger of the ideology of more or less libertarian approach to a self-determining individualism in the socialist countries, the CIA created the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was to pick out things that could be promoted in all of the cultures as the ultimate product of free enterprise. And they got philosophical and economic leaders in the various countries to organize this, take money from the CIA, which was diverting it from the Marshall Plan, vast amounts of money that were intended to restore Europe. The CIA was using to indoctrinate, create exhibitions of art and concerts and journals of science, technology, economics, politics, philosophy, everything subsidized by the CIA. It was a huge fountain of money going into particular CIA-approved ideology, all intended to counter that the danger of those liberating aspects of the socialist idea.
Speaking of the powers that be manipulating society, I mean, I remember very vividly this. I think you had this discussion with Danny about the origins of the HIV virus and how you got approached by a guy in Oregon back in, I think it was the 60s or the 70s, when he said he used to work at Fort Detrick and said there was a virus that was created to target specific racial groups. Well, do you think something like this may have happened, or at least was designed initially to happen with the contraceptive pill? Or do you think it was entirely done to just for profits? Because it cannot have evaded the attention of the powers that be that giving estrogen to women tends to masculinize them and really twist their behavior, like basically make them act not only like males, but like really psychopathic males.
Yeah, the Nazis introduced estrogen for use in the slave camps, concentration camps, because it made them into authoritarian people who would follow orders and, if necessary, harm their fellow inmates.
Is there anything published on that, or was it entirely just like anecdotal?
Barbara Seaman was the one that gathered up some of the information. I think her book has references to where she found it.
Okay. So do you think because the initial contraceptives were pure estrogen and then they started adding these toxic synthetic progestins at some point, was this just to appease the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church was starting to wisen up on the idea that the estrogen pills were actually abortion pills, they're not contraceptives?
Yeah, it was the fact proven in the 1930s by my thesis advisor at the University of Oregon worked on the fact that estrogen at any level is creating abortions. If it has been implanted for 2 weeks or a month or 2 months, the dose has to be bigger, but you get the same contraceptive effect. But they all work after conception has happened. So at every level, estrogen since the 1930s has been known to be an abortion pill. And it was only in the early 1950s when they started thinking of a way to sell it as something other than an abortion pill, and they called it a contraceptive with absolutely no evidence. But that was just a sales point to shut the church up.
Ray, what do you think about all the toxic masculinity, the racism, and all the things that are kind of occupy the minds of a lot of Americans? That psychological operation and those topics ramping up after Occupy Wall Street. Somebody was Google trending those terms, and it was showing like a steep incline right after around 2011. Maybe the Occupy Wall Street really scared the powers that be.
What term?
Oh, like the topics that we're allowed to talk about, the racism, the toxic masculinity, feminist intersectionality, all those types of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the control of Occupy Wall Street. The government allowed the industries to have snipers ready overlooking the demonstrations, ready to shoot the leaders if things got out of hand. So the government was completely sympathetic to treating it the way things happened in the Ukraine. There were snipers shooting people on both sides to rouse the crowds against the government. and the point was to kill the leaders if the movement started being successful, and so the surrounding apparatus, everything from assassination down, has been put into action.
Have you noticed? I think what Danny was asking is that have you noticed that throughout critical periods of history in the Western world, whenever the powers that be feel threatened by a specific movement, they immediately start invoking these controlled opposition themes such as racism, feminism, whatnot. Not that they're not real topics, but they're immediately provoked or immediately invoked to sort of like shift attention away from the real problem, which is the existence of the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, the divide and conquer idea. You have people putting their attention on things. They were mostly not issues in the socialist countries, but they made them issues specifically. A transgender thing that never would have taken off by itself, but was promoted by government and industry as part of the distraction.
What was the distraction that was used around, let's say, when Kennedy was shot or MLK was shot? What did they pull out of their sleeve back then?
A discussion of whether it was Russia or Cuba that was responsible.
Did it capture the public imagination, or what did the public see right through it?
Oh no, total capture. At first, there were only 3 or 4 skeptics publishing, and it took 20, 30, 40 years to develop a fairly sizable skeptical population.
Did nobody question the fact that the chairman of the Kennedy Commission wasn't it one of the Dulles brothers?
Wasn't it what?
One of the Dulles brothers, wasn't he the chairman of the Kennedy Commission?
Alan Dulles, yeah, the whole thing on its face. Anyone who was paying attention immediately knew it was a coup, but M.S. Arnone had a little newsletter called Minority of One. He immediately gave a detailed analysis of what would happen as a result of this coup. Absolutely correct. And it was, I think, something like November 27th when he sent it out. But people who, instead of reading that, maybe 1,000 people read it, but everyone else was reading the newspapers and listening to the radio and TV, and hearing the discussion of how Oswald was a Marxist who had defected to the Soviet Union and came back and visited the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico, and they were, I think they call it sheep dipping. Mm-hmm. They were creating this legend around him so that when they needed someone to kill and put off the assassination on a victim, he had this aura of Marxism around him, but he was actually just a normal Texas Marine right-winger who worked for the CIA on the U-2 spy plane, knew the codes needed to use radar to shoot it down, which the Soviets hadn't had, So then they had him with that information defect to the Soviets, and then when he was in place, and they wanted to block Eisenhower's attempt to establish détente with a summit meeting in May of 1960. They flew the U-2 plane, Gary Powers flew it over the appropriate rocket sites with the information Harvey Oswald had, and got it shot down, or if that failed, it probably had a self-destruct bomb in it. Anyway, they arranged for it to fall and interrupt the détente Eisenhower had in mind as his legacy for ending the presidency. And when his job in the U-2 business was finished, he came back, and they continued his the creation of this aura around him by having him join the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, get in the news by having a fight with the anti-Castro people, get on the radio, interviewed as a Marxist, member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which he wasn't really, and distribute leaflets in the street, pseudo-Marxist propaganda, but with the address for getting in contact with him on this leaflet was the same address that the CIA and FBI used in New Orleans. So that they didn't do a very thorough job of cutting his connections with the CIA, which have eventually been brought out.
Are you familiar with the interviews of this lady called Kay Griggs? She describes all of these things that you just mentioned in great detail as well. She was married to the chairman of NATO's Committee for International Policy. I don't know what exactly, but he was basically involved in multiple assassinations. She talks about how that what was that the head of the United Nations that was killed in Africa. It was a Swedish guy.
Dag Hammarskjöld.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. She has a number of different interviews, and she talks a lot about basically the entire army is just a muscle for the corporations, and how everything is just a big economic game, and then basically the CIA, the FBI, all of these are just enforcement arms of the industry. But anyways, long story short, so you said that most of the public happily gobbled up whatever false story was given about the Kennedy assassination and MLK assassination. So I guess we're living in better times these days, because it looks like at least half the nation is at least greatly suspicious, even if they don't know the whole truth. The half of the nation does not believe the official story that is being fed to it by mainstream media at this point.
I think that's part of the reason that the Great Reset is going so fast now, using the pandemic virus as a way to take information control, turn the whole society into a robotized, smart, artificial intelligence controlled system, just because of the unrest that expressed itself in Trumpism. Half of the population very disgusted with the Clinton, Obama type of government, wanting something radically different, but they're afraid it could turn into something more constructive and more dangerous to them.
So basically, now that there's a critical number of people who just mistrust anything that the powers that be are telling them, they're saying, "Oh crap, we better hurry up because we don't have much time left."
Yeah, and they're hoping that being subservient enough to get vaccinated repeatedly and by the hundreds of millions, that this is going to drive their control faster and faster.
What do you think they will do, considering that the official, even the mainstream media says 7 out of 10 people are now saying they will not voluntarily get the vaccine, even if they get paid to do it? Do you think at that point they may start getting the military involved and saying, you know what, it's not going to be a choice?
Yeah, I just saw a video of a guy in a military uniform saying that with the emergency authorization of the FDA, that the military is getting organized to vaccinate 100% of the population within 24 hours, simultaneous in vaccination of the whole population.
But how is that going to do it? The military is what, like 5 million people total? How are they going to vaccinate 300 million people?
Probably deputizing local police.
Okay.
These article titles are like they're from The Onion. Vaccine safety to remain unclear until millions get their shots. And then this one, doctors say CDC should warn people the side effects from COVID vaccine shots won't be a walk in the park. Do you think they're preparing people that there's going to be side effects and almost like incepting the idea into people's heads so they can't complain about it?
Well, the fact that they're starting with the minorities under the guise of fairness and equality, but they want the millions of minorities to be the ones to take the first testing risk.
Did you see? I mean, you probably haven't seen it because it's a tiny state. It's not a real state. I live in D.C., Ray, and they recently passed a law under the cover of COVID-19 emergency. Now they're allowing children as young as 11 to self-consent to vaccination behind their parents' backs. And actually, the law gives full retroactive immunity to doctors, school personnel, insurance companies, whatnot. And they actually require them to lie to their parents. If the parents call and say, "Did my child get vaccinated?" they're legally allowed to say no. So what is your plan if this gets to the point where now it's actually getting to the point, at least in D.C., where these vaccinations will be mandatory? Would that be your essentially like the point at which you say I'm going to leave?
Yeah, and that's the point at which they'll seal the borders.
You have to present your certificate before they allow you to leave.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the vaccine, there was a Forbes article, and it was talking about how the vaccines were targeted for like mild symptoms and not for kind of the communicable nature of the virus. And so nothing you don't know, the vaccine trials were set up to totally fail, but I think the average American would think vaccination means freedom from disease. And so I think there's a bait and switch going on here.
Yeah, the irrationality is more than sufficient at every level you look at it. You don't have to figure much to discover the phoniness of it when you see every bit of things that they're advocating is irrational.
If the mRNA protein that the vaccine contains codes for the spike protein of the virus, don't you think there's a significant risk that in susceptible people, which probably there are more than enough of those, this vaccine may actually lead to very serious side effects, potentially death? And if they start mass vaccinations, we're going to start seeing that at a mass scale, and the public will quickly get spooked.
Yeah, the spike protein causes inflammation by inactivating the enzyme that inactivates angiotensin. So the spike protein essentially turns on our inflammatory system, the angiotensin system. And the RNA allows our own cells to manufacture the spike protein. So we are being prepared to manufacture the activator of our own inflammatory system, which is basically the only thing that causes people to die from COVID, if they die from it. Mostly, none of that diagnosis or determination of the cause of death, none of that has been done in a traditional scientific manner. But to the extent that the virus is harmful to weak people, then it's causing our body to produce the agent that kills people. And they ignore the fact that we have reverse transcriptases that can turn RNA into DNA and integrate it into our genes so that we can pass on the ability to destroy our defenses against inflammation.
What do you think is the onset of action? I mean, what's the time period for onset of action of this potentially highly inflammatory response to the vaccine? Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it hours?
To do what?
I mean, once you get, injected with this mRNA that codes, how long before we actually, before the, proverbial bullcrap hits the fan?
It depends on whether it's spreading by reverse transcriptase. It could happen within the first day or two, and some of the test victims have become very sick within just a day or two. But there are so many counter defenses. The adrenal and other glands can increase to overcome those inflammatory effects. But if your body then increases the production of the spike protein, you could get cycles of inflammation coming and being overcome and then recurring indefinitely.
If you look at the officially published side effects of the vaccines, and not even saying that article that Danny mentioned, CDC said, Moderna or Pfizer should be more forthcoming with people about the potential side effects of the vaccines. And that article says, the side effects of the vaccines are the same as COVID. So I'm thinking, wow, how convenient. So now they're going to administer the vaccine to all of these elderly people, probably in Florida or God knows where, that are already compromised. They're going to start dying in droves. And then we're going to get told that, no, it's not the vaccine that killed them. They contracted COVID. So it doesn't hinder the vaccination campaign.
Yeah, that's a nice development. The flu vaccine is well established as a destructive influence on the immune system, increasing your likelihood to contract non-influenza respiratory viruses. And so the industry just isn't looking at the outcome of a big population that follows a year or 2 or 3 years after a big influenza vaccinating campaign. The immune system is damaged by every vaccination, and you have to look at the long-range outcome from any vaccine, and that's going to be a lot worse with an RNA virus vaccine.
Is the mRNA aspect of this is there some tech that they need for kind of the future, what they want to do, the surveillance type of thing? Do you see any connection between the two, right?
In vaccinating the whole population, they've got everyone located and subservient, and they don't really need to do the injected chips and all of that stuff, because just the process of rounding them up and vaccinating them once they're entered into the system.
But like is there a reason this technology is being employed now, or is it just totally just a crazy experiment that's made even crazier by these being the first mRNA vaccines?
I think Klaus Schwartz made it very clear a few years ago with his books that this is a very convenient way to bring on very quickly the corporate system of control, finances, education, shopping, medicine, long-range medicine through the computer. He has explained that all of this is going to be the only way out for society if it doesn't quickly get everything under control. Then there will be outbreaks of barbarism.
People in the chat, we've talked about this, but people in the chat are asking about how to protect yourself from this vaccine. But I'll interject that one, I think there's 2 shots of the coronavirus vaccine. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, Ray, but the Rockefeller Foundation, they released a paper projected future scenario where they said the ideal situation was to get a vaccine every week. And so it's not like protection from this one-time vaccine that people are going to be forced to get. This is at some point people will have to take a stand because it's not going to end.
Yeah, the Chinese, when they identified the virus, found there were 5 versions of it already existing, different places around the world, especially in the eastern United States. And if there were 5 versions that early, we can probably figure there are now maybe 25 different antigenic versions, variations of the virus. And next year, there might be 125 variations. And so naturally, a weekly vaccination would be an attempt to keep up with the mutation of the virus, but obviously insane.
I did read this little bit about Pfizer. They say set up a secretive trials in Kano, the second largest city in Nigeria, to test an experimental antibiotic, trovafloxacin, and just how evil Pfizer is. And they didn't let these people get the money for killing these kids and asking them for DNA samples. And these are the companies that we're supposed to trust for this warp speed vaccine.
Speaking of Pfizer, a former vice president at Pfizer, Michael Yeadon, Yeadon, has a half-hour video that's very good, especially the last 2 minutes of it. Just a very blunt description of how serious it is and how essential it is that, as he said, right-thinking people stamp out this deadly hoax of a pandemic.
Speaking of protection from the vaccines, I've looked at some of the adjuvants, and in previous vaccines, there isn't much information on the current ones, but all the adjuvants seem to act by activating the endotoxin receptor, TLR4. And also, this mRNA vaccine, it relies on the cells producing RNA for the spike protein. And the tetracycline antibiotics are known to inhibit the synthesis of foreign RNA by the cell. So in other words, even though they're antibiotics, they seem to be able to inhibit the production of viral RNA by cells if the cells get infected. So wouldn't something like a TLR4 blocker combined with a tetracycline antibiotic, some of which are also antagonists of that receptor themselves, wouldn't something like that be a decent protection against mRNA vaccines?
To some extent, yeah. Azithromycin has a kind of anti-inflammatory. I think that's the major benefit of erythro or azithromycin and the tetracyclines is their very strong anti-inflammatory effects.
But what about the? I've seen some articles saying that studies showing that the tetracycline antibiotics are capable of suppressing the production of foreign body RNA, especially from viruses, but they don't inhibit the normal cell's production of its own RNA. Do you think that may be used as a defensive mechanism against this vaccine?
Yep, it sounds reasonable.
Okay. So which one do you think is more dangerous, the adjuvant, which is triggering this inflammatory response, or the mRNA, which, well, I guess the final response is like the production of protein?
The ingredients of the Pfizer vaccine suggest that it contains no adjuvant. It lists two lipids with a mysterious code number, and that's traditional that the FDA allows people to use a made-up name to identify something on the label so that you don't really know what it is. But they list these two lipids in inert ingredients. The only active ingredient is the RNA. But these two lipids, if you Google them, you don't find that particular code number, but what you find is companies selling lipids that can be used as a solvent in vaccines as simply a passive carrier that would let you list it as an inert ingredient. But also the very same lipids are sold as adjuvants. So just by a double naming identity, they claim that their vaccine has no adjuvant, but meanwhile the similar lipids are being sold widely as vaccine adjuvants.
Isn't PUFA by itself an adjuvant? Doesn't PUFA injected directly into the bloodstream cause a similar response?
Yeah, that's the essence of the lipid adjuvant effect.
Okay. So do you think that's because we don't know what those lipids are, do you think that may be the more dangerous part that they're not letting the public in on what may be? It's not so much the mRNA protein, but it's what are those unknown things that are there?
The great alternative in the vaccine industry to aluminum for several years now has been lipids. And so they would have to identify the specific lipid and then show evidence that it's not a wide spectrum adjuvant before anyone should believe that.
Ray, with our last conversation, you called Biden winning. Do we want to talk about this at all? Like, what does this mean for the next 10 years that Biden, it seems like, will be in the White House? And he's tweeting a lot, and he's saying things like he promises things are going to get better. What do you make of that?
It's almost all the same delusion that we've been suffering from for 50, 100 years. Things are always getting better as the power becomes more centralized. And he's promised and continues to choose the people for his cabinet. He's promised that Wall Street will like his program, and the people in charge of foreign policy in the Pentagon are the biggest warmongers in the country.
But do you think he'll be able to survive a 4-year period? I mean, the guy looks like he's about to fall apart. Like, he doesn't seem any healthier than Hillary Clinton. Remember when she collapsed several times during the primaries with when she was arguing with Donald Trump? Like, after that, they literally dragged her out to her van, and like her feet were dragging on the curb. Mm-hmm. I mean, he seems of about the same level of health as her.
Yeah, he does look very weak when he's talking. I don't know if the video was doctored, but there's one circulating that shows him talking about the biblical Psalms, quoting from one of the Psalms, but he's calling them palms.
Well, people were
reading the palms.
People were joking, saying he's the first deep fake president because, like, his announcements seem like they're on a green screen or something. They look really fake. There was a Zero Hedge article, Ray, and it said Joe Biden, the return of the CFR, and isn't the CFR intertwined closely with the CIA? So Biden will be doing their bidding very closely.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's never denied that. The people that were the warmongers from Obama's government went into business as, in effect, industry representatives, but they simply gave industry people detailed instructions who to talk to and what to say to them, instead of getting involved directly as a lobbyist. They were doing illegal lobbying, but making it technically legal by putting it at arm's length. And these people, I think it was the one chosen for Secretary of Defense, who said that building bridges between Silicon Valley's defense industry and the Pentagon was a work of love.
That's what Eric Schmidt is doing, right?
Yeah. The whole system is ready to pop into action immediately in January, establishing the Great Reset. I don't know what day the Davos meeting occurs, where the meeting is called the Great Reset, but it'll basically coincide with Biden starting to apply the Great Reset.
I wish I put it in my notes, but the World Economic Forum was talking, or they did some simulation of cyber polygon. So they're cooking up all different types of things for the future, apparently, of cyber attacks and food shortages. Is there anything you think is more likely to happen that you've read about, Ray?
They really need to control the food industry and medical industry. Those are things that will make people do anything to get medical care and food.
Well, what do you mean in terms of controlling the medical industry? They fully own it at this point. Are you saying like they're going to start mandating people to go to a doctor, or? Just
making it possible only for those who are totally subservient, vaccinated, and willing to accept the terms.
So only those people will be allowed to buy food, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
The people that haven't been destroyed by the lockdowns, do you think the cyber polygon or some cyber attack or resetting people to zero, do you think that's on the horizon? Or do you think there's something else? Because What about the people that can still maintain a living even if they didn't have their small businesses eviscerated by the lockdowns?
If you have land and some trees and animals, you're momentarily able to resist, but they'll just increase the taxes on your land and give it to a corporation when the time is ripe.
So I have a question. All of this Great Reset and the new economic policy and whatnot. I mean, money, at least in a normal world, derives its value from people and their interactions with each other. If they're if they're so consistently decimating the population all over the world, wouldn't that devalue, in a sense, the wealth that they have? Or do you think they'll come up with some other way of, continuously continue to get richer, even if the population is declining?
Yeah, when you have absolute control, then you can create only the wealth that you need, and the useless eaters will get none of it, and so it'll be a better organized kind of wealth.
But if it's funny money, so to speak, if it's not based on anything of value, how are they going to convince other competitors on the world stage, such as China or Russia or India, in other words, countries that can put up a fight? How are they going to convince them that this money has value? Because ultimately, it comes down to using that money for resources or whatever it is that they want that the other countries have. China is going to say, I don't need your fake dollars or fake currency or Bitcoin, right? And same with Russia.
Libya was at the point of doing that, and that was quickly dispatched by killing Libya. And they know that Russia getting together with China and the whole reorganization of the Middle East with their influence, that is a deadly threat, and so World War III is their solution. There's no rational solution. If enough other countries get involved, the Great Reset can be stopped. But if it's only Russia and China, then this new China policy, for example, starting by occupying Taiwan or Formosa and taking it away from any relation with China, that would be a way of threatening and trying to get China under control by threatening to annihilate them with nuclear weapons. But if China resists, then we have nuclear war, basically the end of life on the planet. So the only real hope is that a lot of other countries start breaking free from the empire, so that the Great Reset has to be rethought.
So even the Great Reset is really just a means to an end. The ultimate thing is, for as long as countries like Russia and China exist and they're naturally now aligning the interests against the empire, that's a deadly threat to the empire, right?
Eric Schmidt outlined it several years ago, saying that China is now on track to defeat the U.S. economically, and the only way we can keep our control is by shutting down everything, including Chinese industry, and replacing it with artificial intelligence under our control, because China was threatening to be the masters of the artificial intelligence industry. but instead of destroying China's economy along with the world economy, the U.S. economy was, I think, a 20% decline, 10 to 20% loss of productivity, and China just went from very fast growth to moderate growth. So they didn't get set back by the pandemic. In fact, their position relative to the United States lurched ahead. So that was a great mistake that will have important outcomes.
Right, what I'm saying is that if, let's say the Great Reset succeeds, ultimately that's not enough. All of this industry, including the AI, is very energy hungry. It will still come down to somehow snatching those resources out of the hands of China and Russia, which can only happen by war.
Right.
Okay. So I guess what you are saying at some point is either the empire crumbling or engaging, at the very least, Russia and China into some kind of like a either conventional or nuclear war over resources.
Yeah.
Something I didn't realize till a week ago was the technocratic slave grid made possible by collecting all this info is to develop the AI in an arms race with China. Is that the way you see it, Ray?
Say that again.
Like the accumulation of data about the citizenry is to form an AI to compete with China. Is that right?
No, I think that's separate. They just hope to pour money into selected industries to develop more powerful digital surveillance, and in the background doing all of the manipulation of the population. That's one thing, but concentrating on investment in the corporations, like building bridges between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon, direct corporate government, essentially corporate military operation, and that highly developed artificial intelligence then would be directed towards neutralizing China, getting ahead of them, not just for profitable industrial purposes, but getting ahead for things like inactivating their defense against rockets and airplanes and submarines.
I was reading an article about a year ago saying that China's military program, of course, still highly classified, but they seem to be shifting a significant amount of resources towards developing electromagnetic pulse weapons. In other words, they're saying that now that the world is so fully digitized, they're thinking that they can, either defend themselves or at the very least inflict a pretty severe harm on other countries by plunging them into sort of like the Middle Ages by doing an electromagnetic weapon that will just disable the entire, digital grid of a specific country. So I guess they're expecting that AI that will be heavily involved in the future warfare and planning accordingly.
That was a problem already met about 50 or 60 years ago when they were starting to get computer controls in airplanes, military airplanes, and they thought that they had the technique to energetically knock out the navigation system, and it turned out that the Russians were using old vacuum tubes that were resistant to these electromagnetic interferences that were designed against transistors. So they've been working, the U.S. has been working to destroy defense systems for now several decades.
So do you think, I mean, how much value do you assign to that whole concept of AI? I mean, we've discussed it in the past that without consciousness, there can be no true intelligence. This is all manipulation of structured information that's out without context. It's next to useless. So what could this AI do other than some very specific tasks, mostly revolving around computation? But it's really, I mean, I've worked with AI for at least 15 years at this point. I am in the IT field, and that most of these things that we see on the news, they're just hype, and many of them are lies. Um, do you really see that much promise? I mean, even from an economic point of view in this AI concept? Because I personally am not sold on it.
No, not at all. But it's a propaganda scheme for increasing the obedience of people. If you say that the algorithm will educate you and diagnose you and treat you and do surgery controlled by computers, that you don't need intelligence anymore for any of these traditional human activities. And there will be no intelligence. It'll all be manipulated, like making vaccines appear to be effective by changing the names of the disease. You change the death records or paralysis records or whatever, just rename the particular disease, and it has gone away. And that is used to sell the effectiveness of vaccines. And it's constantly being done. Right now, they're practicing diagnosis by an entirely invented new baseless set of definitions. Has nothing to do with determining the cause of sickness or death. And so the artificial intelligence will be validated in terms of simply changing the rules and the definitions. So the students educated remotely according to the stereotyped classes that they're presented with, they will be diagnosed as having outstanding outcome of their training. If you control the definition of the outcome, you can make anything look good.
What was that guy from the 60s? He was a civil rights guy from a civil rights movement. He said the power to define terms is the ultimate power. With Josh Rubin, I think, or maybe.
Yeah, the control of language is the ultimate power.
Okay, so in terms of so here's the thing. But all of this AI, it has to live. Again, I'm coming back to the value of money, right? So I guess now they're going to start changing the definition of what economic growth is, because if this thing is mostly fake, I mean, it's not fake, but AI is not nearly as great as they're trying to hype it up to be. Then economic growth will continue to lag real economic growth. So they have to come up with some other kind of a story as a cover. So they'll just redefine what growth is.
All of the official government numbers on the economy have been rigged now for about 20 years. They used to publish the money supply in terms of bank accounts and dollars and investments. About 20 years ago, they stopped making public the actual extent of the money supply so that they could pump fake money in to keep the stock market climbing. And same with unemployment figures. They have rigged it so that most of the working force can be unemployed, and it looks like it's only 4 or 5% unemployed, because if you haven't found a job within so many weeks, then you're no longer in the working force.
So you're not counted as unemployed, even though technically you are.
Yeah. All of the numbers published by the government are now totally fake for the last 20 years.
Speaking of redefining diseases to explain one with another, have you noticed, at least, especially, I mean, even at this point in the official mainstream media, they're saying that the flu season has mysteriously vanished in pretty much every country around the world.
Yeah, you can see that happening the first or second week of April of this year. Suddenly, there was no more influenza. It fell off a cliff, and surging instantaneously, the same amount of hospitalization and death was taken over by COVID. Looking at the curve, you can see it's just a change of name.
So the explanation, if you've seen the official articles, is like, well, of course, flu is going to disappear because everybody's been practicing social distancing. My question then is, so why isn't COVID disappearing as well? Have you ever seen anybody ask that question?
Which question?
Well, if they're saying the flu is disappearing because everybody's been practicing social isolation and there's a lockdown, right? But then why isn't also COVID-19 disappearing? Aren't they the viruses? So if it works for one, it should work for the other. Both should be disappearing. What's happening with COVID-19? How come it can resist the lockdown and the isolations?
That people like Michael Yedden make it very clear that people are just saying in the almost context-free way, they're just saying what you should believe with no rationality or evidence to say why you should believe it.
Do you think...
When did the education, one last question, when did the education in the U.S. start to become context-free and teaching and damaging people's minds to really take everything on faith instead of asking questions? Was that a gradual process, or just did it really all fell off a cliff after a certain amount of time?
I think it accelerated after about 1960. The 1947, through government action, all Lamarckians were fired in high school and colleges. All Lamarckian teachers disappeared, and progressively since then, there has been a refinement of education, eliminating dissent in every field.
So basically, do you think there was also something that was driven by the CIA, or was it like a more of a concerted government policy? Nobody has interest in a thinking public.
The CIA was there organizing it and orchestrating it, but it had defenders in every agency. The Pentagon didn't want anyone questioning the harmful effects of radiation, and so they fired biologists and physics professors who insisted on discussing the effects of biological damage by ionizing radiation. Every field that impinged on one of the interests of the powers had to be removed from the schools.
I was going to ask, Ray, do you think Michael, what's his name, Yadon, is trying to atone for his sins working for Pfizer?
I think he's probably just been in a position where he could perceive the evil that is growing everywhere in the system.
Speaking of, I can read the donations here. I'll read those real fast. Fob for £5. Thank you so much, Fob. Kana for 1,220 yen. Thank you so much, Kana. Harry Burgos for $20. Linda Bell for $5. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Linda. Chris H for $20. Thank you, Chris. Michelle for $50. Thank you so much, Michelle. Christina Tomaj for $19.99. All long-term contributors of the show. Sincerely appreciate it. I will forward those directly to Ray. And Ray, we usually, I've almost kept you for 2 hours, conscious of your time. But what are you working on right now?
A newsletter on temperature, the effects of body temperature on everything. People, for a variety of reasons, have been getting everything wrong. The rate of aging theory, for example, people were saying you should live slower and colder, and it led to a kind of a fetish of cryotherapy, chilling newborn babies' brains and dropping the temperature during heart surgery or treating brain injury, and neglecting the harmful effect of lower body temperature, such as increasing anaphylaxis and allergy and chronic degenerative symptoms.
I love that because I interface with the paleo community so often, and that is something that has never worked into their ideas, that the temperature and pulse rate are very important. I recall from a previous conversation, you were saying the specific mitochondria or the respiratory enzymes are sensitive to temperature, but the whole thing just stops when the temperature declines of the cell, right?
Yeah, the redox balance shifts towards inflammation as soon as your oxidation energy slows down.
Did you know? I'm sure you've seen, but even the American Cancer Society has a page of treating cancer with hyperthermic therapy.
Yeah, I knew someone that I quoted the Italian research on it. The much higher success with prolonged hyperthermia, just sitting in a hot box, than all of the conventional treatments for those particular cancers. So she heard that the government had approved 2 or 3 centers in the U.S. To test hyperthermic treatment of cancer, but they had the requirement that they accompanied it by a mild radiation treatment. So she decided that to get the effective heat therapy, she would give in and have their mild radiation treatment. And after a couple sessions, she described that they had a heating pad on her abdomen, and she asked how they knew that it was heating her body. They said it was controlled by computers. The computers knew. And asked her how much radiation she was getting. By the second session, I think it was, she had received 800 rads.
Wow.
And they were planning to double that, but she was getting nausea, radiation poisoning symptoms to such an extent. I don't think she wanted to continue, but it was a total fraud. There was no attempt to have an internal thermometer to see if her body was really reaching a therapeutic temperature. They just had this magic heating pad on her, said to be controlled by magic computers.
Yeah, I saw some of the studies that were done in animals. They achieved up to 60% full cure rate by raising the body temperature to about 40 degrees centigrade.
To 41.
To 41,
they found that even old people could tolerate sitting in a box slightly over 40 degrees Celsius for 8 to 10 hours at a time.
So do you think the fact that cancer patients often have bouts of fever, that's the body's attempt to essentially raise the temperature and treat itself?
Yeah, I think that's what the various unorthodox treatments going back more than 100 years have done. They activated the fever system to get your temperature up to at least 40 degrees C.
So metabolic uncouplers such as dinitrophenol and aspirin, maybe part of their anti-cancer effects is precisely this raising the body temperature?
Yeah, right. Aspirin does tremendously increase our respiration rate and heat production, but the medical world insists on classifying it as a fever breaker. That they won't acknowledge that increasing respiration and heat production will contribute to hyperthermia, but several experiments where they combined it with a smaller dose of caffeine or adrenaline promoting things, the dose of aspirin tremendously increased the fever, produced the hyperthermia. So it is a thermogenic substance despite its silly anti-fever reputation.
There was an article that came out maybe 2 months ago, and it said that one of estrogen's primary metabolic purpose may very well be the opposition of progesterone's raising of the core body temperature. So estrogen is a very potent temperature reductant.
Yeah. Many years ago, a Russian experimenter knew that rabbit ears were very cool compared to the body. They implanted bits of ovaries into the skin of the ear, and the animals went into a constant estrus, a sign of continuing increased estrogen production. So the cooling of the ovaries increases estrogen production, and when you measure the temperature of the ovary compared to the surrounding tissues, very weirdly, it's about a degree or more cooler than the adjoining tissues.
Does cortisol also lower core body temperature?
Yeah, except when it's breaking down your protein, a severe toxic excess of cortisol will heat you up so much that it will raise your temperature. But the tendency is to stop the respiratory energy production, so it can lower your temperature chronically.
The hyperthermia, how are those people being exposed to the high temperature and it not causing a stress similar to like maybe a very hot shower or sitting in a very hot bath?
You have to keep drinking orange juice.
But are those people having the therapy keeping their blood sugar up?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You tend to faint after an hour or so if you don't replenish your carbohydrate.
And then I think in your autism article, you referenced hyperthermia for autism. Is there when you heat up the body, what exactly is happening to presumably reduce serotonin and other mediators of stress?
It does reduce those estrogen-related things, but the brain works better for every degree it increases up to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And people have tested the mental performance, reasoning, and memory, for example, giving various tests and putting a heating helmet on. They effectively were increasing IQ simply by raising the temperature of the brain.
I was reading articles on methylene blue also being an uncoupler in higher doses, And I know that back in the day, I think both St. Georgi and Broda Barnes, and I think Selye noticed that cancer cells preferentially uptake methylene blue precisely because of their highly reductive metabolism. And I thought that there's also this thing called a photodynamic therapy, which combines red light with methylene blue. And if tumors preferentially take methylene blue, which is itself an uncoupler, wouldn't the same thing as heating the entire body can be done more in a more targeted way by taking some methylene blue and then shining red light on that area of the body where the tumor is?
Yeah, if it's making the tumor blue, then that would absorb the red light.
Okay. I'm thinking as a way of like less, I guess, less risky instead of heating the, well, I guess heating the entire body has other benefits, right? If the brain operates better at high temperature, the brain itself, a better operating brain can control the tumor growth too, even if you're not directly targeting the tumor.
Yeah, as a chronic thing, I think the development of the tumor thrives on the inflammatory environment of a low brain temperature.
So all of these therapies that are promoted now online called cold thermogenesis is essentially asking for trouble?
Yeah.
So we had a few more donations. The Great Awakening for $10. Thank you for that. David Hendricks for $20. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Great Awakening. Gene, longtime contributor, as many of these people are, for $20. B-Love for $149. Thank you so much, B-Love. Jackson for $5. Thank you so much, Jackson. And I'll send those straight to Ray. And Ray, you confirm you are receiving my PayPal forwards?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. With that, I mean, I could keep asking you questions. Georgi, do you have any last burning questions for Ray?
Nope, I think we should allow the man to eat. He's been with us for 2 hours.
Again, sincerely appreciate you joining us, Ray. Thank you, Georgi. Ray, any parting words?
Nope.
Well, actually, can you let people know how to subscribe to your newsletter and purchase your books?
Ray Pete's newsletter at gmail.com. That's the address for both newsletter and books.
And then they can order back issues as well by emailing that address?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
One last question from me. What's the status of the digitization project for your books? Because you mentioned a couple of months ago, I think, that you're working on that.
Yeah, I don't know of any progress. It's partly intention, but it'll come along.
Would they be in a PDF format or just available through a library? Is that what's the end goal here?
Getting it more accessible easily is the basic goal.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that would they be similar to the newsletter, would be distributed in a file, or would be through a library where you just people will go and will be able to browse and maybe buy or rent or whatnot?
I think getting it downloaded to the readers probably the best.
Okay. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ray. Ray, stay on the line. Georgi, thank you so much. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, everybody watching, liking. This show will be on BitChute and every other place. This show is available in a few hours, so I'll do some work after this to make it available for those. Thank you, everybody. We have an amazing listenership. Sincerely appreciate it. Have a safe weekend. Take care, everyone. Talk to you guys soon. Okay, bye, everyone.
Stay sane.